Good afternoon. We'll begin with our webinar on the regulation of the capital markets and the impacts on the ESG practices of the company. It's a highly relevant topic. So we have witnessed a regulatory environment that has been advancing together with the companies, of course. I have great professionals here with me from Brazil and from overseas. It's going to be a quite interesting webinar with a highly important content. Let me introduce our guests. We have Bruno Luna. He's been 13 years with the Brazilian SEC, the CVM. He's the superintendent of the Advisory Board for Economic Analysis and Security Risk Management. Flávia Moura, the Director of Issuers for B3 since 2015. She is in charge for the listing supervision of the Brazilian and foreign companies and also the investment funds. She's in charge of the assessment and the application of the rules for the special segments for corporate governance, especially for the new market, as we call it. And then we have Brian Matt. He's the head of ESG advisory with the New York Stock Exchange, and he's in charge of the analysis of the listed companies in regards to ESG and their journey, the journey of the companies. To moderate this panel, I have here Emerson Drigo. He is the partner of VDV law firm and sub-coordinator of the technical committee of the IBRI. He is also part of the IBRI committee. Emerson. Yeah, good afternoon, Rosanna, and thank you for the introduction. I would like to thank the panelists, Bruno, Flavia, and Brian. Thank you for being here to promote this debate. That's very much important. That cannot be denied, you know. Some time ago, we said that it's a fad. It was a fad. It was never a trend or a fad. It's no longer the case. I think it's highly important in the journey of the corporations. So we have here the super experts on the topic. Let me add on to what she said. Well, you can follow in English or in Portuguese. All you have to do is click on the globe and select the language that you prefer. Well, once again, I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you for everybody in the organizing committee. I would like to pass the floor to Bruno. So Bruno is going to say his introductory words on this topic. And then we're going to have Flavia and Brian. And if you want to submit your questions, you may submit through the Q&A button here at Zoom. And then we'll be submitting the questions to the speakers. Thank you. So thank you all. Thank you, Rosanna, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Emerson, for the invitation. I would like to thank IBRI. We have here Brian, Matt. It's an honor to be here talking to you, Brian, and Flavia, my dear friend from the Brazilian SEC, the CVM. It's an honor to be here. So my idea here is speaking a little bit about the study that was recently published by the CVM on the ESG agenda. So the key conclusions will be addressed, as well as what we see as a future vision related to this topic. Before addressing the study itself, I think it's worth pointing out the purpose of the study, what it was, and why we decided to study this topic. In 2020, when the CVM, the Commission on the Values, when they were discussing the reference form to introduce the ESG in our form of the Brazilian SEC for all of the corporations that are listed, the committee at the time, we call it collegiate. So they were fully convinced that they needed to understand the key movements and trends of the international market so that we could, you know, regulate safely and sustainably. So in the very same meeting, actually, when we approved the public hearing for that purpose, and then it became resolution number 59. At the same time, we also approved the study that was conducted by us. So we had the IBGC as an important partner. They worked with the international benchmarking for that purpose. So let me tell you what we decided and why we decided to carry out the study. Our study highlights directly the growth in this market. So we made an assessment of some markets in the US, Australia, Canada, the UK, European Union, and also Japan. So in these markets, and today I'm going to take data from 2020, $36 trillion in sustainable investments. It's always nice here to say the number, but you have to use a certain angle, because if you ask 5 people what is a sustainable investment, we're going to have 5 different answers. So it's always nice to be careful with the figures. So we were very much careful in assessing that in our study. But if we take the growth from 2016 up to 2020, we see that in these markets, investments in ESG grew by 56% in the analyzed markets, And there are other studies showing that in 2025, after 2025, actually, more than half of the assets under management in the world will have some connection with this theme, the ESG agenda, in many ways, in many fashions. So this really shows how this is relevant. So it's not a fad, as you said, Emerson. If it was a fad in the past, it's no longer the case. So our work, in addition to focusing on the conversation with the regulating agencies, the regulators, engaging the SEC, the FCA in the United States, and other regulating agencies in Canada and the United States and the UK. We also conducted this internal survey in the Brazilian market to understand the vision of our investors, and we had direct conversations with the companies. And I highlight the conversations with the companies. We decided not to submit questionnaires. We truly talked to them because we wanted to see them speaking more openly to us. So we had just published resolution number 59. And they could understand that we were somehow trying to see their practices, to see whether they were prepared or not. This was not the purpose. We wanted to have an open conversation. And let me tell you what we saw in our study, in talking with the regulating agencies and also in doing this survey, this international survey. Well, the first point is that climate change is, the top-notch concern of the regulators. The top of mind. So we asked this in developed markets. This is interesting because in Brazil, when we talked to our investors, and we had a questionnaire at the time, so the climate change was indicated as the key concern. People wanted to have more information on this, but the social pillar also stood out. Well, this is about our market, Brazil. Brazil, we have not settled, of course, our social issues. So somehow this contributed to this vision in our market in Brazil. But around the world, climate change and issues connected to the climate are the key aspects, the most relevant aspects. Number one. The other matter has to do with the reporting standards. This was widely discussed in the SEC public hearing. So we received suggestions to adopt a specific standard for the reporting of information on ESG. And then the Brazilian SEC did not decide to choose that. And I think we did the right thing. Based on what we talked with the regulating agencies and in doing this international benchmarking, it is a fact that the existing standards for publicizing the TCFG recommendations, the GRI recommendations, they are inspiring, of course, for the regulatory movements, but hardly ever, I think, the markets would adopt a single standard or establish something. But they're going to be inspiring elements for the regulatory movements that we are about to witness in the forthcoming years. Well, the other aspect that was highlighted, our study has to do with the detailing of information. So today in the markets, especially the more developed markets, we observe that ESG detailed information is more voluntary than mandatory, although we have observed movements and we have seen, public hearings. Everybody's doing the analysis. ever since we've done the survey. So they decided to do or to have more prescriptive metrics in regards to ESG. The emissions inventory, for example, the greenhouse gases emissions inventory, for example, among other metrics. But today, what is in force is a voluntary movement more than a mandatory movement. But I believe that the market is moving towards a more prescriptive metrics. The other point that was quite clear in our study has to do with the greenwash. And definitely, this is the key concern, one of the key concerns of the regulating agencies. Well, although we've had, direct meetings with the regulating agencies, and it seems to me that they have set rules for their markets, and the first concern will be, having a more educational approach than a punitive approach. And that's a very important factor. And we even say that in our paper. This will be potentialized. This is something that will haunt us, but we must have an internationally accepted taxonomy. So I believe that taxonomy is the key discussion point that is going to follow through after the initial movements, the regulatory movements. And as I said, talking about the market regulators for the SEC, there is no rule, no standard. I believe there are going to be important movements late 2023, early 2024 about the rules that will be set forth in regards to transparency for ESG markets, for the security markets. Now, speaking about the survey that we did vis-a-vis the Brazilian investors and the conversations that we've had with the companies, the Brazilian companies, it's worth pointing out regarding the Brazilian companies that 2/3 somehow supported initiatives related to increasing transparency, for example, on ESG matters. This was quite clear in our survey. And about the investors and respondents that did not use ESG metrics in their choice, in their movement to choose investments, for example. They highlighted standardizing information because we lack standardization of information. Because today we have some companies that provide information voluntarily only, but they also addressed the reliability of what is reported voluntarily by these companies. So these are 2 points were points that stood out in our survey. About the companies. In the interactions that we've had with the companies, I believe that the major conclusion of this conversation was that there is this major concern of the companies because they don't want to see the wheel reinvented by the regulating agencies. If the regulatory movements do not follow the line of what we had already in terms of reporting standards, well, the costs will not exceed, the cost will exceed the benefits. And it may be harmful to some sectors because they want to follow through the same line of standardized reporting that we see today. And this was clear for the companies and for the regulating agencies, and they were all concerned about the greenwash. Greenwash is a major concern, especially for the companies that have some sort of a solid reporting structure. They've been doing it for a while, so it's quite clear for them that they are concerned about the greenwashing. It is a predatory competition factor because there are companies that have, good practices for publicizing their data. And now going to my final points about the conclusions of our study. I think it was quite clear to us. The Brazilian SEC will try to keep track. We are not reinventing the wheel. I think we are going to go into a second phase. The publishing of resolution number 59 was the first movement. So it is expected from the Brazilian SEC incremental movements in regulating transparency for ESG as the discussions grow more mature. So this is quite clear. So I believe that the Brazilian SEC will also follow the same trend, working with the same spirit. I have no doubt that as of next year, in the first reporting of the companies, we are going to use the information that are going to be made available by the companies so that we can do the second wave of information collections. Then we are going to take a deep dive in this second wave of movement, regulatory movement for the future. The other topic is that there is no silver bullet. I think that a regulation is not going to sort it all. It's not going to sort everything overnight. So I think that following the international trends will be important, especially the movements that will come from the European Union. The European Union is a continent, so they made this decision to be the leader in this agenda. So I believe that they are going to be the inducers of the regulatory movements regarding ESG. Well, the American market is the largest one. We know that regarding ESG. And I would like to reinforce taxonomy. Taxonomy is fundamental. And somehow this is what will make the regulators and the investors and the issuers more comfortable regarding the greenwash. So the Brazilian SEC today has this working group with the market institutions aiming at studying taxonomy. I'm sure this will become a whole agenda, a strategic agenda for our country regarding this matter. And this is a topic that somehow we are going to be engaged into in the following years. So that's what I had, Rosanna and Emerson. This is the end of my contribution.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you. Very important remarks here. I think, yeah, CVM has been extremely careful, thus making the right statements. I'm pretty sure that the market is getting this the best way possible. I don't know, Rosanna, if you want to say something. Otherwise, we may hear Flavia representing IBRI, which is a public space. And today we had a public hearing on diversity and steering committees and boards. I don't know, Rosanna, if you want to say something, or otherwise Flavia is ready to start. Flavia, please. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Emerson. Thank you, Rosanna. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks to IBRI for this opportunity. I think it is clear how important is this partnership between IBRI and IBRI. Along this time, Bruno, dear friend, a very old friend. I'm not saying how old, but you know, I don't want to embarrass you, but it's a very old friendship. And Brian, we have a very, you know, we respect the work of Nicey, and I'm so happy to be with you here. So yeah, not giving you spoilers before my talk. We will get there, but just want to give you a couple of initial remarks on B3 as the regulator of so as a company, as a public company, as B3, let's say, we take care of these diversity matters. We are working for a while with 5 different diversity areas. The first one has to do with gender diversity. And then we have a second panel responsible for racial issues. Third is for people with handicaps, and we have also LGBT, QIA plus, and we have another area another group working with generations. How can you deal with different generations working in the same corporate environment? We have the B3 social, which is focused on education matters, but not limited to education. Now we are talking, for example, about um, hunger programs, or I mean, programs to fight hunger. And as B3, as a company, in this first dimension that I'm saying, in the end of last year, we issued a social bond. It was the first stock exchange to issue a bond like this with goals on B3 when it comes to the managerial levels. Managers, superintendents, we will pay more this bond if we do not fulfill our diversity goals. So we have some initiatives when it comes to the company, B3 as a company. And then we have B3 as the infrastructure, a creator of products to the market that appeals to diversity and the ESG initiatives. We have Easy, which is an indicator. It has a new format and it's always evolving. We have some other indicators like the index portfolio that it can be linked to ESG. We have a partnership with Great Place to Work, GPTW, and we want to create and identify the transparency and usability indicators of social and green bonds. So this second dimension as an infrastructure in the market, as a provider of new products in the market, is also a very important role. And now, just I mean, this meeting cannot take place in a better day than the one we are having now, because yesterday we launched our what we call the connection or value connections for the companies. All the actions that has to do with engagement and um, indicators is in this under this brand, value connections. Our first demand in this sense has to do with our intention of helping the companies to learn more, to uh, apply important measures to ESG. Some figures. I know the product was, or value connections program was launched yesterday, but our fora in ESG this year has reached 100 companies and more than 300 participants of sustainability or diversity and inclusion. And it was 500 companies last year, almost 1,000 participants in this ESG forum. It's not something trendy, and if it's a trend, it's a trend that is here to stay. I gotta say that. Today, we launched something to the market. We have a public hearing that we did today. We want to listen to the investors, to the issuers, the general society. I think the social issues is it goes beyond the companies themselves. So we have an internal or international mapping activity. We didn't take this out of the blue. We did not wake up eager to put some rules on the market. We take a look at what other countries are doing and we understand our demands here. So in this public hearing that we started today, we have two important pillars here that are complementary to all the initiatives that we are leading over here at CVM. With this public hearing, in the beginning of 2023, we expect companies to have in their management positions, in the mix of management positions in the board or in the management council, we need to have at least one woman or a person that states him or herself as a woman. and a member of a minority community. We include here Black people, we include LGBTQI plus and handicapped people. Okay, so yeah, it has some we have some room for adjustment till 2025. We need to have all the companies that are listed in B3 following these requirements. And it's a model which is very interesting. We will engage the companies so they can adjust themselves to this new environment. And if some companies have problems, they may present publicly the reason why they are not following the rules. Okay, so that's the first level, like in the C level. The second pillar, it has to do with transparency. We need to have some goals that are related to the bonuses we pay to the executives linked to ESG initiatives. We need to have policies that reflect the diversity and inclusion activities and some internal rules, policies or rules that can be related to governance, to compliance. So we are really excited about this initiative. Is something we are listening to the market and to people. We will have this public hearing till the 26th September, and then we will approve in B3, we will approve the guidelines, and the CVM will approve our guidelines, and we expect to have this rule in place in the beginning of 2023, respecting, of course, this deadline that we have for implementation, 2024, 2025, and even 2026, depending on the case. So yeah, companies will have enough time to get prepared to align with what the world is expecting from us. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Flavia. And yeah, I think it's a very important thing because we see that we are talking about 3 letters. We need to talk about the other 2 letters. We need to talk about E, we need to talk about S, we need to talk about G, beautiful initiative. And yeah, we will implement this in different companies. And I'll give the floor to Brian so he can talk and how nice is following this and how the G board is working on this with the companies listed in the United States. And maybe he can tell us a little about this new proposal of the SEC, right? That affects the primary issuers in the United States and the foreign companies. Brian, please.
Well, thank you, folks. Thank you, IBRI, as well as thank you, Bruno, Flavia, as well. It's great to have the live translation working here, so I can hear everything on the same language as you folks. This is working out great for us so far. So hopefully my translation goes well into Portuguese for all. But thank you for the time today. I work with, I'm head of ESG advisory for the New York Stock Exchange. My role is to work with the 2,400 listed companies of the New York Stock Exchange, primarily in corporate investor relations, corporate sustainability, and corporate legal teams, mostly to help them tell their ESG story out to investors as well as to other stakeholders. Our goal is to provide them the tools and advisory and the connections that they need with other companies, especially when it comes to best practices for other companies that have built successful sustainability programs as well. That's the approach that we've taken as NYSE. We have to date 28 Brazilian companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange that total 400 billion in market cap. So that's the universe that I face within Brazilian companies. Many, of course, that are also listed on B3. I also sit within NYSE. Our parent company, ICE, Intercontinental Exchange, also has a number of other ESG-related businesses. We have an environmental markets business that quotes futures and produces carbon pricing for us. Essentially, all of the compliance carbon markets in Europe, UK, etc., are all priced using investor quotes based on matching buyers and sellers of carbon futures. Therefore, if you've seen a carbon price, it's likely quoted from my parent company, ICE. We also collect ESG data on about 10,000 companies globally. We publish indices, as well as we've produced climate risk models used by companies and investors, as well as we do collect data on, as Flavia mentioned, green and sustainable bonds that are produced out in the market as well. So I guess I'll speak a bit from the U.S. market approach, and I'll say the U.S. markets have not been as aggressive in terms of regulation or in terms of legislation. NYSE, of course, much of our listed company universe will follow SEC regulations. So I'll get to those in a moment as to some of the things that SEC has done. But we really have seen very little in terms of regulatory or legislative requirements that have been placed on companies. However, even in the absence of those requirements, at this point, 92% of the S&P 500 produce CSR, corporate sustainability, or ESG reports for use by their investors. That's without any type of requirement at all. The reason they're doing that is because their investors that own the largest percentage of their shares have told them they need to see more information about what's not on the financial statements, but might be important in them making investment decisions or voting decisions on those positions on those companies. I also talk to then not just the larger companies, but also to a lot of smaller companies that are just starting out in their ESG programs. Any new IPO that comes public in the primary markets now has to start thinking about the story that they'll tell out to investors, as well as to customers, to regulators, to communities out in a public format as they become a public company. To date, then we can look at the investor side as well. I think Bruno made some comments to this. There's a lot of different definitions of what is an ESG investor. I don't mean to suggest that our definition is better or worse than any, but no matter what, you see inflows of new capital flowing into these portfolios of any definition that really have not been there before, into impact portfolios, into dedicated ESG positive screening or negative screening portfolios, into thematic portfolios. Because all of that new capital is flowing into the market, that's part of the reason that companies want to be able to attract as wide an investor base as possible and build a full and fair valuation. So the way companies have approached this, companies have built out their own ESG stories by listening to their stakeholders, determining what the most important values are that they should be measuring. Oftentimes they can be financially material as well. And then communicating those stories out to their investors as well as to other stakeholders. I did some math earlier. Out of my 2,400 listed companies, about 800 of those have a head of sustainability as a defined role in the organization that is responsible for measuring, collecting, and conducting operational work to help companies improve, not just report on what they're doing in the environmental or social worlds. I would say if you asked me what that number was 2 years ago, it might have been 200 companies. So this is a role that is expanding drastically within companies as they realize the demands of those stakeholder groups and the fact that essentially providing more information to make decisions helps them grow revenue and attack opportunities as well as address risks. So I'd say that the one comment I hear back the most from companies as they gather their stories and start to tell them out to the markets, the one goal that I hear when it comes to the regulatory world, companies want to see harmonization. We have so many different standards that exist out there across different regions, different NGOs, different structures. Companies are more than willing to collect the necessary information for all stakeholders to make decisions. Their goal is they would like to be able to measure once and report to all of those organizations. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of progress in the last year in terms of the new climate disclosure proposal from SEC, from the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, in Europe from EFRAG, the organization that is updating European requirements. A lot of those organizations are aligning fairly closely with the approach that they're taking. The TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework, I think we mentioned earlier, is fairly well aligned between each of those organizations. And it does hopefully offer an ability for companies to, especially if they do business in all of these markets, to be able to produce the same measurement for the Brazilian market, for the European market, for the Japanese market, for the Chinese market, and so on and so forth. Ideally, that's what companies are looking for. Now, as to the SEC regulations, SEC in March proposed mandatory climate disclosure regulations that would apply to not just US headquartered listed companies, but also to foreign private issuers. So again, some of those Brazilian companies, Latin American companies, I think we have 120 Latin American companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange that would be covered under the initial proposal as it stands at the moment. Those companies would be required to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, measure those emissions in a standard format with attestation as to how that emissions information is collected and how it's reported going forward. Those companies would also have to disclose their approach to climate using the TCFD framework that we spoke about before, and make sure that they are addressing and identifying both physical risk and transition risk the same way described in the TCFD framework. So I spoke to a lot of companies about this proposal. You would be surprised the diversity of responses. There are some companies that were overwhelmingly supportive of these new regulations. Some companies overwhelmingly oppositional, but also across each of the items within those proposals. We didn't get a broad agreement of 100% of companies thought something was right or 100% thought something was wrong. There were a lot of different opinions that we heard. I have within the NYSE, we have a Sustainability Advisory Council. That's comprised of the heads of sustainability of 22 of our listed companies, split across every industry, utilities, healthcare, technology, energy, so on. And from that group, those organizations, those individuals have each 10 plus years experience in sustainability. That group did enter a comment with the SEC that aggregated up some of the feedback that came from other companies and did make some suggestions as to how best to push forward with such disclosures. That said, we had a lot of companies that were very supportive of such regulations. And normally you think of companies as not wanting to follow any other new regulations. So it's a fairly mixed set of feedback when it comes to results. The SEC is expected then to produce a final rulemaking later this year or potentially early next year. I'd say as NYSE, we are generally interested first and foremost in the capital formation process. We want to make sure companies can go public and that the ability for companies to go public, it does not necessarily increase the cost of those companies to too high a level. But also we do need to make sure that investors have the information necessary to make decisions, not just financial, but extra financial, environmental or social information to make those decisions. We also want to make sure, and I'm sure Flavia would agree with me, that we don't want to disadvantage the public company structure relative to the private company structure. It's a positive for all companies to be able to approach the public markets and be able to reach the individual investor who provides so much of our framework as an investment market. There's one other regulation the SEC proposed not long after that. I think Bruno spoke a bit to this earlier, but it was around greenwashing by fund managers. There's now a rule proposal that will be produced, and then an inquiry into rules around fund managers' disclosure. What does a fund have to tell you about how it makes decisions on the portfolio companies it owns based on E or S or G? If a fund labels itself an ESG fund, what does that mean? They do have to disclose how they conduct their analysis. We also expect later this year, SEC will have 2 more rulemakings that we'll see. One will be on board diversity. We do expect SEC to provide a rulemaking on disclosure of board member gender, ethnic, racial, as well as board skills diversity. SEC is likely to publish a rule at some point on that front. And also additional rulemaking on human capital management. There are some prior rules that were not very prescriptive. SEC is expected to produce more rules that will require companies to disclose how they approach the human capital subject overall in terms of employee training, in terms of diversity across the employee base, for example. I think I'd finish with, I'd say, as NYSE, I see the market evolving in a few different ways. First, just in general, the sustainable finance world, when we talk about retail investors, individual investors, it's now possible for an investor to match their values to investment strategies much more easily than it was before. There are so many different ways that a financial advisor can measure the values of an individual or of an institutional investor and be able to match up investment strategies with those. With all of these new investment vehicles, I think it will continue to grow the sustainable finance world across all asset classes. I think companies will continue to act on decarbonization as they set their targets and start to decrease their carbon footprints over time, not just because investors want them to, but also because their customers want them to, because the communities and the countries that they operate in, the social fabric that they operate in wants them to. And I think companies are listening to their stakeholders in that sense. I do think carbon markets will grow and help set prices globally for carbon to help companies make those decisions. And in the end, I think ESG data starts to look much more like financial data. And at some point, we stop talking about it as ESG data because it just becomes investment data. It's something that you need to make an investment decision. So I think we're headed in those directions broadly over time. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think in the end, the investors want to know exactly what they don't know, right? Otherwise, they won't look for us. Okay, we have some questions here in the chat. Flavia, this one is for you. Congratulations to B3 for your initiative, a very important and impactful one. The companies, they will need to include in their boards 2 people. Is it possible a company to fulfill, let's say, with a 1 person, 2 different misrepresented profiles, let's say a Black woman, for example? And why the implementation deadline is so long? Wouldn't be better to, to make this faster? Thank you, Jaime, for the question. It's a very interesting question, and it helps me to give you more details on this. So I appreciate the question. In the public hearing, you will notice that yes, if you, for example, select a Black woman being a counselor or someone in a chair of the directive board, it can be counted as 2 requisites, like 2 profiles, being a woman and being a Black person. So yeah, a single person can do both, can meet both criteria. But of course, the idea is to help the companies and help them learn how to work, right? And let them understand why it's important to have these people in the top management positions. But yeah, one single person can be enough for both elements. About the deadline, I think that's a wonderful question because we have two possibilities why we are opting for 2 years after this after the rule statement, like two, 2025 for the first member and 2026 for the second member. Why is that? Because I think we are following the international trends. When you see the international discussions and the debates, you see that the rule of NASDAQ, Australia, United Kingdom, right? Tokyo, in general, maybe United Kingdom is closer than this, but we are talking about 2025 for the full use of this rule. Okay, so we align with the international scenario, and the rule is not because we want to, it's not for the sake of it. Basically, it's a very relevant topic. We know that, but we know the companies need to get, to understand what are the best options and understand how the rule works. And of course, we understand that the confirmation of the board occurs every 2 years, more or less. So if we set the rule for 2023, we may include those companies that just selected their board members so we don't want them to be in a rush. We don't want them to hurry. We want them to be careful. We want them to be, you know, aware of the importance of this. That's why we are selecting this long period. Thank you. Thank you, Flavia. Awesome. There's another question here, and thank you for the answer, Flavia. The next question in the Q&A, you can ask your questions in the Q&A tool here in Zoom. If you want to take a look at the questions, you just click on Q&A. The next question is from Haroldo. I believe is a question for everybody. He's asking us if we can comment. Let me see. Yeah. How do you see the initiative of the ISSB by the IFRS Foundation? And if you have been engaged in public hearings or discussions, even on taxonomy, and if you can comment on the creation of CBPS, which is the Brazilian Committee for Sustainability Statements by the CPC Foundation. And remember that B3 is part of that initiative and the CVM has supported the initiative. So yeah, the ISSB by IFRS Foundation first, and then if you can comment on the creation of the Brazilian Committee of Sustainability Disclosures or Statements, right? Want to start, Bruno? Maybe Flavia, maybe Brian. Okay. Yeah, let me start about the ISSB, right? We have some debates on that. It's something we follow closely. We're there, interested in the discussion. I don't know what's the engagement level of the person that asked the question, but the idea is to discuss some principles that can be followed by the jurisdictions. And a concern we have is that those principles may allow some flexibility in the case of Brazil specifically. So we can, I don't know, give some feedback on those rules or create our own rules that are matching the Brazilian market needs. So on the ISSB, we wrote to them and yeah, we are engaged in the discussions. And as I said maybe earlier, that we have created a group working on taxonomy on a financial innovation lab. So we have this work plan that is in place for the last couple of months, and we will have some suggestions when it comes to this topic. I do believe that the result of this work will become a direction or guidelines for the regulators and understand how can we move forward, right? That's amazing. On my side, really quick, thank you, Geraldo, for your question. Yeah, we're involved. We're engaged in the CBPC initiatives, and I feel we're excited about it. I feel the opportunities are welcome because I think the initiatives that must be discussed should include the disclosures on sustainability or the statements on sustainability. I think that reinforces the importance of this topic, the relevance of that matter, and that everybody can advance in this, that can move forward in this without disregarding opportunities. I think if we may harmonize the initiatives altogether, that would be better and would be more, it will be easier to understand, right? Great. Brian, would you like to comment on ISSB or something?
I can speak a bit to it. We did do an introductory session with ISSB and with our listed company universe about 2 months ago at this point. We did not, as NYSE or as ICE, comment directly ourselves, but many of our listed companies, both as their in their own stead, as well as through various industry organizations, were directly involved in commenting on both the climate as well as the general sustainability disclosures. I think the general point that we heard, there was one group of 80 public company CFOs that all signed a letter supporting the ISSB program, as well as supporting its approach to harmonization. So again, making sure that ISSB is taking in feedback from outside organizations, working with SEC, working with European regulators, working with other global regulators to produce a single standard where possible. ISSB's structure is designed to be adoptable by various securities regulators across the globe, but to have it be a baseline standard that hopefully will produce more comparability for investors and more harmonization for issuers.
Amazing, Brian, thank you. We have a question for you, Brian, in the chat, if you want to take a look at it. Fernando Carnero is asking in English. So he says, Brian, do you think in the long run it will be more feasible not to look into E, S, and G, right? And like individually, right? And different demands and variables. What do you think about that question we have there?
Believe I know the individual who asked it. Believe he may have read last week's issue of The Economist, whose cover story was that exactly. Probably a lot of folks on the call here did. I'd say the investors we speak to from the data set that I'm involved with, that my parent entity is selling out into the investment community, investors already consider environmental information separate from social information, separate from governance information, when doing their analysis of a company. It's so much easier to see a single score that combines them. But even the former chair of the SEC, Chair Clayton, had asked questions about why a single score should be possible for a combination of E plus S plus G. Either way, I see companies comparing their own water usage against other companies. And I see investors making decisions about water usage. I see companies comparing their own decarbonization plans against other companies. And I see investors making decisions on decarbonization plans. The one place where that really somewhat breaks down to the use of the score is in the passive world, where an index is created based on just the ESG score that combines all three of those. That's a growing universe, but the active ESG community is far larger than the passive ESG community to date. Active funds are roughly 3 to 4 times, Bruno, depending on the different definitions here. Active funds are roughly 3 to 4 times from an equity perspective what the passive side is. So I would say the market is already making that statement of treating E, S, and G independently.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. That's perfect. Flavia, Bruno, and if you want to ask something to each other, feel free. All right. It's a debate. So we have another question here from Geraldo Alfonso Ferreira. And I understand the question is maybe to Bruno, but if you want to say something about it, feel free. Yesterday and today we had some news saying that maybe explain the question, and it says how CVM is intending to judge the controller vote in case of conflict in topics related to ESG. Like the jurisprudence analyzes only the cases that involve material conflict, right? So yeah, we have material conflicts and other types of conflicts that maybe do not involve materiality. Are we waiting for 20 or 30 years to come to discuss the materiality of a consequence? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it reflects our conversation. It's I think it's a topic that, how can I say this? Maybe is controversial. We have many opinions on it. It's a decision on CVM that CVM is discussing. All right, we are asking to see the process. We are not making decisions yet, but it's a debate that we need to let it happen. How the conflict resolution will take place when it comes to ESG. But I don't have an answer yet for that. We're still waiting. I cannot even answer that question now. We need to analyze case by case. And it seems that the person asking the question is not really satisfied with the results of these judgments or these assessments, but it's what we have so far, right? Thank you, Bruno. Thank you. Next, it's an anonymous question. It has to do with Flavia. And for ESG emissions in the internal market, we follow the SLB principles. In Brazil, B3 or any other regulator can develop something similar?
So thank you, Rosanna, for the question. So before talking about this topic, I would like to go back to the topic that Fernando addressed and Brian answered. And I agree with Fernando, because for very specific questions, for very specific topics, where everything is seen individually, when you talk about decarbonizing, there is a focus that is too high on the environment, on the E of environment. But the beauty of the 3 letters, being built together, being addressed together, overall speaking, this really helps each of the stakeholders of the individual letters. When they get together, we gain more strength to foster the agenda. So perhaps down the road, they will separate, the letters will be separated, segregated, but I think there's this beauty of having the letters together, ESG, because now we can gain more traction on these topics, because together they tend to move faster and better. Just adding to the answer. Now about the specific principles on the issuance of the securities. I believe that we have an agenda looking into the Brazilian market in this case. We still have an agenda that comes before this one, that is enhancing the transparency of the securities that are issued in the Brazilian market. We have a wealth of data, but this is widely disseminated, spread out in the system. So how can we further improve the publicizing, the reporting of this kind of security associated to ESG matters? So this is the more immediate focus. It's an emergency focus, as I would call it. So let's handle that first. That would take an effort not only of the market structure, but the entire market. And then after that, there will be this evolution process. And then will be addressed the next item on the agenda. But more immediately, more emergently, we have to improve transparency. We have to improve data reporting so that we can make it richer, so that we can make the system more secure, both for issuers, investors, and other stakeholders, the stakeholders who act in this ecosystem, in this market. So that's our focus now, I would say. Thank you, Flavia. So we have another question on the Q&A from Vania Borgerth. She wrote in English and she says, Brian, I agree with you. Thank you for your presentation. I agree 100% with you about the consolidation of the regulation in order to better report the business results. And then she would like to know your opinion, if you have your opinion on how SEC will regulate the work of the ISSB and the European Union rules, how SEC will handle that. Do you have an idea regarding this?
So specifically to climate. So SEC proposed its initial climate disclosure proposal on March 21st. ISSB released its climate disclosure proposal for standards on March 25th. The two of them lined up fairly closely in terms of adherence to TCFD, as well as recommendations around disclosure of climate risks and the view of measurement of greenhouse gas emissions. EFRAG, the European organization responsible for updating European disclosures, also then subsequently published its own set of rule proposals, again, closely aligned with TCFD, as well as with GHG emission disclosures for companies. So the timing for each of those, at least at the outset, was to suggest that rules would be available in each of those three consultations by the end of 2022, for a first measurement year of 2023, and for the first reporting year, potentially in financial statements of early 24. So the fact that there's so much alignment between each of those, not just in their substance, but also on the timing, and the fact that, of course, SEC, as a member of IOSCO, does work closely with other global regulators. IOSCO has a seat and direct input into the ISSB process, as well as European regulators through ESMA into the IFRS ISSB process. The point there is that all of the regulators are speaking to one another, and they do have a goal. It's fairly evident by looking at the way this is rolled out, of trying to harmonize as much as possible. Now, the reality is there will still be daylight between different countries, different regulators' rules in some ways, depending on the type of stakeholders that those countries face over time. But I think it's a positive that we see regulators wanting to work together and potentially produce that reciprocity between each market to, again, limit the amount of reporting costs to allow companies to be able to approach international capital markets across the globe. So I'd say we're seeing that movement in that direction, and certainly all regulators are aware of what has worked and what hasn't worked when it comes to different mandatory, different comply or explain structures, That's how you see across public companies how to make the best steps forward in regulation. And hopefully, we're seeing regulators listening to each other, learning and moving forward. Bruno, you might speak to that well also from where you sit too.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I would like to make a brief remark on this. I fully agree with Brian. We have been keeping contact with other regulating agencies. I participate in the Forum of Emergent Risks of IOSCO. So I'm sure that at a certain point in time, there will be some sort of debate. There'll be some guidance to harmonize the rules. I have no doubt that this will happen. IOSCO will somehow be engaged into that movement more actively. I have no doubt about this. Another remark about the harmonizing, and I'll piggyback on what Flavia said before. So there is this quite interesting report from the Global Economic Forum 2020 publication, a special publication that was made. So they do a self-criticism because they really focused on development. They focused more on the GDP, economic growth, and they were leaving aside sustainability. It's quite clear in their reporting. But they truly address the importance of enhancing transparency on ESG. They acknowledge there'll be difficulties, there'll be lack of harmony in this process. They acknowledge that. And what Flavia said is perfect. Their message is that the countries should be truly engaged in broadening transparency as the first exercise. And then later, after that, of course, you could go shaping as you go about and harmonizing the many rules. I think this will happen naturally. We live in a globalized world. We have international fora that coordinate the initiatives between the regulating agencies. So definitely, I think this will happen in the future. Thank you, Bruno, and thank you, Brian. Quite enlightening. So we are coming to a close, more than 1 hour. So I would like the three of you to say your final remarks. And please, we are talking about ESG practices and the regulatory environment, but what are the opportunities, in your opinion, for the corporations, for the investors, and for the regulators as well? I'll begin with Flavia with her final remarks about those aspects. So once again, I would like to thank you. It's an honor to be here, participating in this forum, participating in this discussion. I hope there'll be many more discussions on these topics. Well, it's the soft water, hitting the hard rock, as we say. So will come to fruition. It will come to fruition eventually. So we need to increasingly address these topics. And as Bruno said, we are more aware today, I would say, that we need to harmonize the rules around the world. Globalization is a reality. The borders are non-existent, not necessarily the physical borders, but the globalized world happens on the web, through the network, and the barriers are vanishing. So we should not have this idea that is misaligned with the world. It is because the company is headquartered in Brazil today, but it has operations in the US, in the UK, another branch in Australia, another branch in Singapore. So how can you deal with that within the corporations? How can you deal with this myriad of regulations as an international corporation? But I want to see the glass half full. So definitely there is this international effort so that we carry on and follow through with alignment. It's not copy and paste. I don't think it's copy and paste. We shouldn't see that as a possibility because we are talking about different cultures. We are talking about different social characteristics within each country. But even so, based on what's feasible, I believe that We should have conversations to promote harmonizing of the rules and harmonizing of practices. Actually, practices are more important than rules on ESG, of course. So I'm sure that in some years, if we speak again, I'm not going to blush by having said this today. Thank you, and thank you, IBRI, again. Thank you, Flavia. Thank you for your final remarks. Thank you once again. I would like to thank my colleagues, Brian and Flavia, Emerson, and you, Rosanna. Thank you. We really emphasized our work. The ESG agenda will be a competitive factor in the world, a global competitive edge. So when we think about Brazil, it is our agenda, right? We cannot leave it aside. We cannot miss the boat. I have no doubt that the movements that have begun with Resolution 59 will carry on. When we publicized, when we did, the public hearing, none of the rules that are under analysis today in more developed countries were addressed. So I think we took the right step. I think the second wave of this movement is knowing what metrics make sense and for what kind of sector they make sense so that we can take a safe step towards this direction. The other point that I would like to highlight, still speaking about the opportunities, and the current president, João Pedro, he has really been highlighting this aspect. The Brazilian SEC has been discussing with the Ministry of the Environment about this. So we truly should be engaged. We should create economic incentives to develop some markets to promote environmental preservation. I don't know if you know, but the Code of Forestry has a special chapter about creating economic incentives. We have left that aside, perhaps, but I have no doubt that in addition to transparency, ESG, of course, it's an agenda that will happen, naturally will happen. The regulators in Brazil will be increasingly engaged in developing economic incentives. I mean, products that bring about economic incentives to promote preservation. This is what the world expects from Brazil. It's a huge potential that we have here. Thank you, Bruno. Brian, final.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you, Flavia and Bruno. Thank you, Emerson and IBRI, for inviting me to this discussion and for handling the translation of every word that I probably could have spoken a bit slower. So thank you. I would leave it with NYSE. We're in the business of creating markets within ICE. When we create carbon markets, we're in the business of connecting buyers and sellers of markets to then price a particular item, a particular commodity, a particular derivative. In order to do that, you need to come up with a definition that's agreed upon by both buyer and seller. And we've done that in carbon markets, where we've established what is the definition of 1 ton of carbon removal or 1 ton of carbon prevention. We've established in terms of decarbonization, what do those plans look like and how do they measure up so an investor and an issuer can agree on what they need to make those investment decisions. The reality is, I guess 90 years ago, we came up with a definition of what is revenue, what are assets, what is cash. All of those accounting definitions we had to work very hard to come up with in the accounting profession. And we had a much longer time frame 90 years ago when we settled on those definitions than we do today. But the fact is, if you look at every discussion I have with issuers, with investors, and with regulators, most of those come down to simply how do we agree on a definition of any topic that we spoke about today so we can create a market that has an agreement around it and everyone knows what they're buying and selling. I think we're making very fast progress relative to how long it took to produce accounting standards. I think we're moving very quickly. I think we're listening to as many stakeholders as possible when trying to come up with those standards, trying to be as transparent as possible about how we come up with those standards. And I think generally regulators have the right ideas in mind when it comes to Once we get agreement on these standards, it then opens up the ability for markets to create more value, as they always have throughout the history of capitalism. I think that's where all of us sit today. So again, folks, thank you for your time. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So thank you, Brian. This is the end of our webinar. I would like to thank the participation of our guests, Brian, Flavia, and Bruno. We have discussed for more than 1 hour. We discussed important topics. Harmonizing ESG is not a fad of the moment, has come to stay. It is a demand of the investors, of the companies, and it generates opportunities. So we are all aligned here. So I will pass for my colleague so that he can close the event.